Well, hello everyone, it's John Lockland here. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. I'm speaking to you this week from the Netherlands, and I'm delighted to welcome my old friend George Szamuely, who has stepped in at the last moment. Also very happy, of course, to see my co-hosts Peter Lavelle and Jeremy Nell from South Africa. We're hoping to be joined shortly by, and here he is, Kit Klarenberg, right on the nose.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
It seems that Alex Kreiner might turn up as well. We're waiting with bated breath. The starting point for our discussion is an article that Kit wrote, what is it now, about 10 days ago. Kit, in the aftermath of the New York Times piece, which went into great detail about the American role and the extent of the American role in the Ukraine war. Everybody on this show now, and no doubt many of our listeners, knew this stuff or knew most of it or thought they did, but now it's been, if you like, it's been given the official imprimatur by the dinosaur press. And you, Kit, then wrote a very interesting piece, reading between the lines and also in some cases from the actual text, about the specific role of Britain. I think we all know that America has been fighting this war as a proxy role, but Kit, you've drawn attention to the specific role of Britain, and this is an extremely intriguing line of inquiry, and that's what I'd like to devote our discussion to this week, because as I understand it, Kit, you think that the British are, in a sense, at the origin of this war, going back perhaps even to 2016, and who knows, even beyond. Kit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as you mentioned, on March 29th, the New York Times published this landmark expose into the oversized role the US has been playing in the Ukraine's conflict with Russia. If you have been following anyone who knows what they're talking about, or reading my work for the Grey Zone, you will know that this is just this is hardly news. It's not, groundbreaking, and very, very occasionally the media has previously admitted to Washington's role, such as its involvement in the planning of the 2023 counteroffensive, which didn't go very well for Kiev. But what I thought was most interesting were the passages highlighting London's principal role in influencing and managing Ukrainian actions and strategy, and by extension, the US. And what also really struck me was the references to how Britain was, I think they even used the phrase daring do. Britain was much more willing to insert military and intelligence advisors formally and openly into Ukraine and strike up extremely intimate relationships with senior Ukrainian officials, to the extent that they could have Ukrainian military commanders fired at their command, which is quite striking. It also noted, the New York Times, that Britain was fundamental to the failed aforementioned 2023 counteroffensive, and was pushing for this to go ahead at a time that the Ukrainians and the US were similarly saying, we're not ready to do this yet. And there were elements of the Pentagon who were encouraging Kiev to take advantage of their victories and gains in the 2022 counteroffensive, and wait and build up their forces for something bigger. And the British pushed ahead with this. Now, we fast forward all of 9 days after my investigation, and the Times publishes an almost identical article to my own. The Times of London, spelling out reiterating what I myself reported and adding a bit more colour. One particularly interesting amusing section referred to how one of the axes in the counteroffensive was secretly codenamed Wallace, after Ben Wallace, who was the British Defence Minister. But littered throughout that Times of London investigation, there were several other interesting clues, such as references to senior British military officials having long-standing relations with political, security, military and intelligence figures in Kiev, and being involved in training Ukrainian. And this taking these clues together, it confirms what I have been saying since the very start of this, which is that the war is ultimately a product of British intelligence.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. Could I just ask all our guests, and hello, Alex Kreiner, I'm absolutely delighted to see that you've been able to join us. Could you all please switch off your microphones while you're not speaking, because we can hear a bit of an echo from what Kit is saying. Kit, you have, in your answer just now, mentioned detailed operational involvement of the British in the what they call the full-scale invasion, so in the war from 2022. But as I mentioned in my introduction, you've also documented, you've found chapter and verse on British involvement going back much further. I mentioned the date of 2016, and you've, in particular, you've implied, or at least the documentation that you've found implies, that Britain really took the lead on this, that Britain wanted this war for all kinds of reasons, including to bring the Americans further into NATO. And this really, if it's true, really casts a very, very interesting new light on everything, because I'd always just assumed that this was the neocon blob on autopilot. We all know that the project of dislocating Ukraine from Russia has got, goes back at least 20 years. It's the whole stuff about turning the Black Sea into a NATO lake and taking Russia's imperial status away from her and all the rest of it. But you're implying that this was actually cooked up in London, and that Britain imagined that it would lead the Americans into this war. And this, of course, if it's true, changes a lot about our understanding of the relationship between those two countries. Go ahead, Kit.
Yeah, sure. So excuse me. I mean, I think that what a lot of people miss is the fact that, yes, that the Maidan coup in February 2014 was a product of the National Endowment for Democracy and US aid, and the US, numerous US officials good as admitted that they're openly that they were supporting regime change in Ukraine. And then you have that infamous leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland saying "F the EU" and handpicking the fascist interim government that followed Maidan. But what's interesting is that Maidan occurred at a time when the Obama administration more widely was engaged in a now rather forgotten pivot to Asia. And the purpose was to shift US focus away from West Asia and or the Middle East and Europe towards China and Southeast Asia. And this was something that the British were deeply unhappy about. Obama, of course, openly stated that Ukraine is not a core interest of the US, but it is a core interest of the Russians. And there was the Obama doctrine, where they refused to provide, or at least formally provide, training and weapons to fascist paramilitary groups like Azov Battalion. Now, I found records, they are openly available, from a July 2014 British Parliament Defence Committee meeting on the future of Britain's defence and the importance of Eastern Europe within that. And numerous figures such as James Sherr, who is this rather shadowy veteran think tanker, previously led Chatham House's Eurasian program. That's Chatham House being this very elite British state-connected talking shop, along with military veterans, and Chris Donnelly, who was a senior NATO advisor for many years and was at the forefront of NATO's enlargement into Central and Eastern Europe. Now, the records of their appearance before this committee are very have countless interesting passages, but what really jumped out was that there is a section at the very end where it is proposed that Britain deploy forces to the Baltic states and Poland, and take the lead on this. And Chris Donnelly states that this is a huge opportunity, and it's very important for Britain to do this because it will encourage the Americans to take a greater interest in NATO and reinforce their support of the organization. We have an important role in bringing the Americans in more. He mentions the pivot towards Asia, and he states Donnelly states this is an opportunity for us to bring that perspective back into play in Washington. Now, Donnelly ran an organization known as the Institute for Statecraft, which is this British Ministry of Defense and Foreign Office funded quote unquote charity that was engaged in all sorts of skullduggery and got shut down after a large number of their documents leaked online, shedding some light on the kind of rather nefarious activities in which they were engaged, including running an operation called Integrity Initiative to spread fake black propaganda about Russia globally. The same month that Donnelly makes this appearance at this Defense Select Committee hearing, an essay appeared on the website of the Institute for Statecraft, authored by Victor Madeira, who is a close associate of the former MI6 chief Richard Dearlove. And it openly states that the West strategy towards Russia should be economic boycott, breaching diplomatic relations, propaganda and counter-propaganda, pressure on neutrals, and this will produce a conflict of the old-fashioned sort with Russia that Great Britain and the West can win. And sorry, could I just to finish this point really quickly? I might add that this essay was cited in numerous U.S. Senate and congressional inquiries into the question of Russia, so it was clearly very influential.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you, but I remember that Victoria Nuland was in the Biden administration, and she was the architect or one of the architects of the Maidan. This pivot to Asia, well, I mean, maybe what happened to Obama is what happened to Donald Trump. He had certain ideas about his administration's foreign policy, and his team didn't go along with him. I think you can make the same claim about Obama as well. I mean, it seems to me that if there was going to be a pivot to Asia, we have to finish up business in Europe. I just don't see that we needed to have the UK to drag the US into this, okay? Because the amount of resources and effort putting into the Ukraine project, that goes back to 1991, by the way, even earlier, if you by different estimations here. So, I mean, both stories can be true at the same time, in my mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly true that people like Chris Donnelly align with the most hardline reactionary elements of the US. I mean, like I say, there were, of course, people within the Obama administration, including the aforementioned Miss Nuland, who were obviously very much in favor of this. But I mean, the state or the deep state are not monoliths, right? So, I mean, to give you an example, during 1991, the George Bush Sr. was desperately trying to keep the Soviet Union together in the form of the Commonwealth of Independent States because he feared a situation like the civil wars in Yugoslavia, except with nukes thrown into the mix. And then in the meantime, the National Endowment for Democracy was sponsoring every separatist nationalist group in the Soviet Union in order to break it up. So yeah, I mean, I totally take on board that they didn't necessarily need the British to do this, but the Brits saw it as their role to get the Americans like really heavily invested. And of course, with someone like Newland, they were pushing an open door. With someone like Obama, who, as I mentioned, refused to send lethal aid to Azov and et al., might be a harder nut to crack.
And this is all relevant in the context of things which Alex Kreiner says. Alex, I'm very glad that you've been able to join us. I watched with great interest the interview that you did. I think it was with our friend Glenn Deason, who's also been on this show, where you described or claimed anyway that Britain, or at least Britain in the broadest sense, has a specific interest in this Ukraine war. You went into interests from the City of London. You said that the City of London, the banking system, has an interest in a new asset base from which to launch new loans and new financial operations. And you regularly tweet, Alex, all roads lead to London. And I've read this with great interest, being British, like as indeed I believe Kit is and George, because it reminds me of what Lyndon LaRouche said for a long time. And I always regarded that as complete rubbish. It always seemed to me to be obvious that the Americans were in charge and the British were just desperately holding on to their coattails in order to maintain some sense of importance. But what you are saying, Alex, and what Kit is saying in different ways, is that actually maybe there is something to this. Go ahead, Alex.
Unmute.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the invite. It's an honor to join you today. My take goes back to the American withdrawal from Afghanistan on 15th August 2021. I was very much taken aback about the reaction to this event in Britain, and I read very carefully some of the statements that were coming out from some of the British politicians. And while in the United States the debate was largely about the way the withdrawal was managed, that is, the way it was bungled, the reactions in London were quite hysterical. And they were hysterical in the way as though the Americans took away their toys from them. They were, the Americans have never been really on board. Look, they're no longer playing their global role. And on and on and on. And I thought, wow, I thought you'd be relieved about this as you've been following the big evil American brother into all these misadventures around the world. So now that they're withdrawing, you might be relieved. Phew, we're done with this terrible idea. But no, it was quite the opposite. And so this got me a little bit to pay attention, because I assumed that somehow Britain was far more invested in the Afghani project than we knew. And now I think it's becoming much more obvious with the events in Ukraine. And what I think is particularly revealing is this whole three-card Monty about the Ukraine's rare earth minerals. So just to try to sum it up really quickly, in September of 2024, that is before Donald Trump was even elected, Zelensky comes to the brilliant idea of visiting Trump in in New York, and he offers him a $500 billion deal related to the Ukraine's rare earth minerals. And that was bizarre, but okay, he wanted to make sure that the United States remains involved in case Donald Trump gets involved. All right. Fast forward to January 16th, 2025, 4 days before Donald Trump is inaugurated. Keir Starmer flies over to Kiev and signs a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. That's interesting. So the UK will continue to support Ukraine for the next 100 years, or for as long as necessary, with 3 to 3.5 billion British pounds per year in financial aid, plus military aid, plus so on. That's very, very altruistic in support of causes like freedom and democracy and human rights, right? But as it appears, according to leaks from Ukrainian intelligence and referred to directly by Volodymyr Zelensky in one of his statements, that there's a secret chapter to this agreement which hasn't been disclosed in public. But if you read the agreement that is on British government's website and the press release that went out the same day, 16th January, then you see that Britain is Ukraine's number one partner in development of Ukraine's resources, and that there are parts of the agreements that are not open to the public. And so allegedly, we're talking about all of Ukraine's ports, gas deposits of natural gas, storage facilities, pipelines, nuclear power plants, the electricity grid, and a whole bunch of. So basically, Keir Starmer signed an agreement that hands over for the £3 billion a year to British interests. The bulk of Ukraine's wealth goes to the British interests. Well, that's very interesting, that Volodymyr Zelensky signed this, and the American side was not consulted about this. And so from this point on, the situation devolves into this vulgar three-card Monty played between the British, the Americans, and Volodymyr Zelensky. He goes to see Trump, and before he goes to see Trump, Boris Johnson lands in Kiev, and immediately on the very same day, two things happen. Volodymyr Zelensky, who just before this visit rejected the American agreement, which was put in front of him by Scott Bessent, sent there by Donald Trump. This is in February 2025. So Volodymyr Zelensky says, no, we will not sign this. Then Boris Johnson goes to Kiev, and then Zelensky says, like, all right, well, we're gonna negotiate the deal with the Americans. And on the very same day, Verkhovna Rada in Kiev passes the resolution extending Volodymyr Zelensky's mandate because it expired in May of 2024. So, which implies that Keir Starmer signed a 100-year partnership with a private citizen of Ukraine, not with the president of Ukraine. Now, the fact that Verkhovna Rada extended his mandate doesn't really change things, because it's an unconstitutional resolution, because the Constitution is very clear that the presidential mandate is 5 years and not a day longer, cannot be extended for any reason whatsoever. So, if a government comes to Kiev in the future that realigns with Moscow rather than the West, they can legitimately say, your agreement is null and void, you signed it with a private citizen, and we will not honor it. So, therefore, what is necessary is for the United States to provide security guarantee to Kiev government, as it is, allied with the West, that will honor these agreements, that will honor the primarily the pirate raid of handing the loot from Ukraine to British interests. And to gain this security guarantee, Trump was being hustled with these rare earth minerals, which Zelensky said were worth $500 billion, but which many people, geologists with knowledge of Ukrainian deposits of minerals, say this probably doesn't exist to begin with. It might be in unfeasible amounts. The bulk of what's worth something in Ukraine is already under Russian control. So now you see the wealth, the loot, the pirate raid is already taken by British interests. they cannot enforce it because there's a risk that somebody will come after Zelensky and will tear up these agreements. So that's why they need the United States. But you see, the business, the economic logic.
But Alex, why do you believe under any circumstances that any document signed by Zelensky or anyone in his cadre is worth the paper it's written on? I mean,
no, I don't. No.
And this is heck, okay. I've been living in Russia for 27 years, and I've watched how the Russians have signed deals with the Ukrainians. They bulletproof them. I mean, the Gazprom pipeline where they were sued. Gazprom won in a London court, okay, because they know exactly how to deal with the Ukrainians. I remember when this all started back in Maidan, and Hunter Biden was going to Burisma, and I just said, wow, the Americans are going to have a wonderful time in Ukraine, okay? Because there's nothing is consistent. You can't rely upon anything. Agreements are made. Most agreements are a handshake. So, I mean, I'm not disputing the documentary background that you presented here, but I don't really think it's worth very much, okay? Particularly when these minerals are... If they exist or don't exist, I don't trust the Ukrainian authorities, and authorities that know something about it say, well, a lot of them have been exhausted already, and a lot of it's in the Donbass. So what's?
Yeah, but I think Alex is.
Yes, but this is exactly.
Alex,
we absolutely agree, Peter, because what I'm saying is that the papers are worthless, which is why the security guarantee is necessary. You know, papers are very good if I have a gun on your head and I oblige you to. I oblige you to comply, which is what the security guarantee is, except the European and the British forces, the powers of European and British militaries are insufficient to enforce this, which is why they want the Americans to do it. But in order to induce the Americans to do it, they have to offer them these phantom rare earth minerals.
Or it's just all the ruse to keep the war going.
Yes, but in other words, what the point is that according to Alex and I believe Kit as well, the idea is that it's the British with the brains, as it were, and trying to use American muscle. And this is what the British elites said in the post-war period when the British Empire was dissolved. They said, well, we are the Greeks to this new Roman Empire. We are the intellectual source of it all, but we will ride, we will wag the dog. We will be the tail wagging the dog. Kit, is that your... yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I was going to say, I might just add as well that like the Times of London article I mentioned, it quoted a nameless Ukrainian source as explicitly stating that the British are the brains here. Yeah. So America's the wealth and the muscle, and the Brits are the quote unquote brains of this total and utter disaster. Yeah.
And how far then? Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Sorry, Winston Churchill himself used to say about the special relationship, it's the American brawn for the British brains.
Yeah. But Kate, what about Boris?
Sorry. Go ahead, please.
No. I wanted to ask you a question, and then we'll bring in George in a minute. But I wondered, what about the April 2022 visit by Boris to Kiev? But all these people, by the way, are my old friends from Oxford, including James Sher and Boris Johnson. But anyway, we'll leave that on one side.
Yeah, I wonder if there are any infamous photos of you with the Bullingdon Club, John. But in all seriousness, yeah, you also have in April 2022 the visit from Boris Johnson to Kiev when when the Russians and the Ukrainians were on the verge of signing a peace agreement. Now, I've written about this on my website, and I think it's important to again there's been a clear break in British and American thinking, at least in certain quarters, on the proxy war. So before Boris Johnson flew to Kiev, he was explicitly making a lot of noise about what the scenes in Bucha, which is remains very murky event indeed, not helped by the British blocking a Russian request for this to be investigated by the UN. Before he flew to Kiev, he started talking about how what happened in Bucha was a genocide, and this encouraged other governments to say the same. Now, he at the same time, Britain's quote-unquote counter-disinformation unit, which censors social media, began policing content related to Bucha online. So it was... Yes. So it was suppressing any and all content that suggested this was anything other than a massacre of innocent civilians by Russian soldiers because they are genocidal maniacs. Now, at the same time, you have there was a nameless U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency official quoted in Newsweek, who was speaking bitterly of the Bucha effect and dismissing any suggestion that what happened in Bucha, even if it was a massacre of civilians by Russians, was in any way genocidal. And he warned that this had led to frozen negotiations and a skewed view of the war.
Kit and Victoria Nuland, and since then was interviewed about Istanbul, and she didn't even mention Bucha. Wasn't even mentioned. It was.
Do we think then that Boris was
because the Russians were unwilling to disarm? I'm paraphrasing her. Okay.
But do we think then that Boris was just an American envoy, or was he?
That's what it looks like to me.
Was Boris doing this on his own initiative? Was this a British initiative? The Boris's visit to Kiev, or was it? So how do you understand that? And we'll bring George in a minute.
Yeah, well, no. I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing from George. But I mean, I think that this just speaks to the kind of what James and I were arguing about earlier, which is the fact that I think Nuland herself has even boasted about how the Istanbul talks were deliberately sabotaged. But like I say, like the US military and intelligence complex is not, and its political wing, it's not a monolith. So I mean, it is quite clear that there were elements of the US power structure who were worried about pushing this narrative that it was a genocide because it would keep the war going at a huge human and material cost. There are quite clearly other people like Victoria Nuland who are very keen for this to keep going. I mean, on some matters, British and US perspectives align. On others, they don't. I mean, to give you another historical example, when in 2013, I believe it was August or September, you had that alleged chemical attack in Ghouta in Syria. There were US officials who were saying the intelligence on this is not a slam dunk. Who was collecting the intelligence on this? It was the British. There was an MI6 program to smuggle samples out of soil samples out of Syria to prove that the government was carrying out chemical weapons attacks. There is a contemporary media report on this operation by MI6 where it explicitly states we are doing this to give the Americans the evidence they need to intervene in Syria. And if they don't, there's very little point in us doing this. But of course, there were elements of the US power structure who wanted to go to war with Syria.
Well, this is getting a bit of a pattern, isn't it? Because there's the British role in Ghouta, there's the famous 2016 Steele dossier, there's obviously the 2018 Skripal business. George Szamuely, can we zoom out? How do you assess the real relationship between Britain and America? Is it the tail wagging the dog?
George. You got it.
Fine, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to me, it goes back to the Suez Crisis debacle. The British decided that they were a serious player on the world stage, and they openly defied the will of Washington. Washington actually cracked the whip, and the British fell into line. And that was a very profound lesson for Britain's elite. Never, never, never again fall out with the Americans. Always keep in with them under all circumstances and do everything possible to facilitate American involvement in Europe, American involvement in NATO. And that is what they've done. I mean, occasionally they got very nervous when they thought that the Americans were losing interest in them. At the time of the Falklands crisis, I don't know if people remember that, there was briefly panic in London that the Americans might choose Argentina over Britain because Argentina was more important in the war in Central America, and they decide, well, the Argentinian generals are more important than London. It didn't happen that way. The Americans decided London was more important because of the Euro missiles and everything else, and Thatcher. But ever since then, everything that Britain does is in order to keep the Americans involved in NATO. And so when we look at Ukraine, or whether we look at Syria, when we look at Yugoslavia, it's always, whatever the British are doing, it's always in order to keep the Americans engaged. And now the case of Trump is, of course, very interesting. Why did the British get so involved in trying to stop Trump? Because it reignited all their nightmares that there will come along a leader who is not going to be particularly pro-British. He's not going to be an Anglophile. Ironically, Trump is an Anglophile, but they didn't know that. They thought he was just some American cowboy. And he's going to start looking around the world and say, hey, we've got more interesting and more useful partners than the British. And so that's why they got so involved with the Steele dossier. And more than that, I mean, there was a very active intelligence operation to prevent Trump from coming to power. So, going back to what we were talking about a moment ago with Boris Johnson, I always took it that Johnson was acting on behalf of the Biden administration. And that was how Naftali Bennett described it. And he was involved in the negotiations. He said, yeah, of course, Johnson was working with the Americans. So I don't think that the British are the brains behind the operation. I think the British are absolutely joined at the hip to the Americans. And whenever the Americans seem to be wavering or deciding, well, we've got other fish to fry, there comes the British to say, no, you've got to be involved in this. And that's what Keir Starmer did. Keir Starmer was one of the first visitors to Washington after Trump's inauguration. And he was flattering him and, heaping praise on him and so on, and doing what he can to provide the American backstop. He wants the American backstop. Yeah. So we'll have British involvement here, but we want the American backstop.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It hasn't worked. At least it hasn't worked now.
It's not working.
Not so far. No, I agree. So far, it hasn't worked.
What are the British going to do now? Because they're faced with a major dilemma.
Well,
Kit, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off, George, but I think that on this subject again, spooling back to the Institute for Statecraft, like Chris Donnelly's creation. Chris Donnelly is now overseeing Britain's contribution to the proxy war, and I've reported on leaked emails between Donnelly and senior British military officials where he states that Biden's reluctance to get further involved in the proxy war needs to be countered immediately and at once. So from Britain's perspective, the US weren't sufficiently all in quite clearly, and they felt a need to try and challenge and counter this. But I might add that in October 2016, Statecraft had this private briefing from Richard Barrons, who was this British, very high-ranking British military veteran, where he talked about how, well, we have vital interests around the world, but that's being challenged by China and Russia. Our power of initiative and decision-making is ebbing away, and there is the risk that the US can no longer protect us. And he talks about how we need to deal with Russia by doing things that are serious. And he suggests if no catastrophe happens to wake people up and demand a response, it was necessary to manufacture catastrophes to whip up public fears of Russia. Now, individuals involved with statecraft were central to the circulation of the Steele dossier in the US. The Integrity Initiative launched by statecraft was pushing all of these nonsense stories of Russian meddling, like they were behind it all, whether that's alleged Russian backing for the Catalan independence movement. That hitherto Spain and Russia had positive relations. That fake news, as it were, about secret Russian backing for Catalan independence damaged relations between Spain and Russia. So I mean, yeah, it's quite clear that yes, they are conjoined at the hip. But if they feel that there is a sense of the Americans pulling back in any way, then they will engage in manipulation and skullduggery to try and.
So the question is to Alex, to Kit, and to George. So this has less to do with Russia and Ukraine, and more about just keeping America on the continent. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes.
That's pretty pathetic. Okay, I mean, all of the death and destruction. Yeah.
I mean, I think just to close out this point as well, is like in my neck of the woods. In summer 2023, there's this British MP called Alicia Kearns, who she is a former British intelligence officer who then decided to become a parliamentarian. Just before the summer recess in 2023, she gave this speech in Parliament where she was effectively calling for war with Serbia, and she explicitly and repeatedly slammed the US for making peaceful overtures towards the Serbian government, and how it was a betrayal of Bosnia and Kosovo, and that the US shouldn't be doing this. And then you fast forward to today, and Britain, I think that Alex has written about this. David Lammy just conducted a whistle-stop tour of the West Balkans, where they were forging military alliances with Kosovo and Bosnia and all these other places. This is despite Britain's own military not being able to fit in Wembley Stadium. You know, it's really quite extraordinary.
Alex, do you want to intervene? Alex.
Yes, I was in Croatia. I'm in Croatia now, but I was in Croatia a few weeks ago, and then came out the news that the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina signed a military cooperation agreement with the government of Great Britain. And I thought, what? Why? You know, Bosnia is like a mountainous country in the middle of Western Balkans, and you know, United Kingdom is like an island nation far off to the west in the Atlantic. What on earth is this military cooperation agreement about? And, you know, it's not like Britain is this predominant military power in the world, so you want to have a military cooperation agreement with them. It's not like they have weapons that everybody covets. It's not they have troops that they can send. It's not that they have logistical networks that they can provide support to you if you feel that your security is in jeopardy. The central government in Bosnia is Muslim dominated, right? It's Sarajevo is the Muslim canton of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if they felt like they were in jeopardy, maybe they should seek military cooperation with a fellow Muslim nation like Turkey, or maybe like Albania, or if they're fearing Serbs to the east, maybe a military cooperation agreement with the Croats in the west, because during the wars in the 1990s, actually, Croats and Muslims had a military alliance, which was broken up by an event similar to Bucha in Ukraine. It was a massacre in Ahmići, a village called Ahmići, where allegedly Croatian troops slaughtered a bunch of Muslim civilians in this village. At the time, there were rumors that this was orchestrated by British Special Forces. And it was very compelling. And people who were there, who were in the know, they said, like, absolutely, the orders didn't come from Croatian generals in charge. Then came, I think, 1996, and the BBC they were vexed enough about this event that they published a documentary film about this event in Ahmići. You know, and the Brits were there, but they just wanted to preserve peace, protect human rights, democracy, and all these things. And then these primitive Balkan peoples just couldn't keep off of each other's throat and slaughtered each other. You know, first there was like a smaller scale massacre of Croatian villagers in in a neighboring place by the Muslims, and then Croatian staged a bigger massacre of Muslims in Ahmići. Well, I just met literally a few weeks ago a man who worked for Croatian intelligence at the time, who was involved with these events. And I said, please explain this to me. This has been a mystery for me for the last 25 years, 30 years. And I said, who is responsible for the massacre in Ahmići? And he said, oh no, it was the Brits, 100%. So the BBC documentary, imagine that, was a lie. But at the time, in the 90s, I thought if the BBC makes a documentary about something, then they will tell us the truth, but they didn't. So, in the same way that they are there in Ukraine, they're there in Bosnia. And then, if you pay attention, they have a military agreement outside of the scope of NATO with France, with Sweden, with Poland, with Ukraine, with Kosovo, with Bosnia, with Israel, with Turkey. They have a very close military cooperation with Qatar, which is coddling these extreme part of Hamas, who live in a lap of luxury there, and on and on and on and on. Wherever there's blood flowing in rivers, the British, and I hate to use this word even because I grew up with Blackadder, with Rowan Atkinson, Roger Waters, all these good people.
That's how they get you. That's how they get you.
I know, but
they con you with Harry Potter and Only Fools and Horses. It's a deliberate strategy.
Yeah, no, but it's there's always this foreign policy cabal, which has been running world events for the past 200 plus years, and whose strategy always has been to sow chaos. Because if you have monopoly on financial credit and weaponry, then chaos suits you, because you can pit side against side. You can tell them, hey, we're going to give you money. We're going to give you credit so you can maintain your government. And we're going to give you weapons so you can defend yourself against your rivals. And then you do the same deal with the other side. And so for as long as they're at war against the other, you're their dealer. And you get to give them credit. They're in debt to you up to their eyeballs, and you sell them weapons. But, the world has changed.
But you're saying this can only be done with American backing.
Well, that is the fact, because the British don't have either enough weaponry or enough troops or enough logistical. They cannot bring carrier strike groups to your shores. It has to be the Americans. But I think that, we've been talking about them being joined hip to hip. I imagine it more as, for people who are old enough to remember Mad Max 3, the Master Blaster combo, where you had this dumb giant, and then you have this old decrepit dwarf sitting on his back and directing him what to smash. Yeah, so I think that the special relationship is a Master Blaster relationship.
Again, we are concentrating.
It's what the Iranian. It's exactly what the Iranians say, is that the US is like the great Satan, like this lumbering beast, and like the British are the sly fox by their side, just this like conniving little shit. I think that kind of cuts to the core of it quite neatly. Sorry,
that is the subject of. That is what we're talking about, is the role specifically of British intelligence. I mean, the British intelligence services, but that of course implies actual intelligence. And Alex, as well as I do, that it may seem odd objectively that Britain has a role in Bosnia, but Britain, of course, did have a very substantial role in the Balkans during the Second World War through Special Operations Executive Fitzroy MacLean and all the rest of it. George, what's your take on all this?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, the Muslim Croat Federation, I mean, it was created, largely engineered by the Americans, because it was their only hope of defeating the Serbs. They didn't defeat the Serbs, but basically otherwise the Serbs would win the war. And so they brought them together just in order to be able to hold their own in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, I see that what the British are doing in the Balkans now is a continuation of the NATO-American policy. They feel that there's a lot of unfinished business to accomplish from the 1990s. They wanted to see Serbia defeated. Serbia wasn't defeated. They want to see Kosovo recognized as a new state, internationally accepted, big military base, big ally of NATO's. They want to see the Republika Srpska, the Serb part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, extinguished, so there's a unitary state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So all of the things that they thought that they had accomplished during the wars of the 90s, really they didn't accomplish. So they cheated like mad afterwards, you know, with the Bonn Implementation Council and all the rest to try to overturn these agreements. They haven't succeeded. And so Kit talked about this, Lisa Kearns, and this is an ongoing thing. Liz Truss talked like this, David Lammy talked, and they always just come back and they vent their rage at the Serbs. You know, it's still as if we're back in the 90s, because ultimately this was just unfinished business. And for them, the Serbs are a stand-in for Russia. You know, they basically want to remove all Russian influence from
Europe. George, who is they in all this? Is it the Americans or the British or both?
Well, I think it's both in this case. Yeah, I think it's both. But there are divisions within America. I think the Trumpian, there are people within the Trump world who I think are quite well disposed towards Serbia. Have, you know, like Rick Grenell, Trump's son-in-law. They've got their business agreements. This obviously makes the British very unhappy. They don't like Rick Grenell. They don't like Jared Kushner. They don't like the fact that they are quite friendly with the Serbs. But they're hoping that, you know, they'll see Trump off, and then the kind of the usual foreign policy types, the Biden, Obama creatures will be back, you know, and everything will go back to the old days. But at the moment, they're in a kind of holding pattern, you know, waiting to see when they can see Trump off.
Yeah, you're muted, Peter.
Since we're talking about British intelligence, I'd like to ask our guests, can they thwart Trump in this term with his efforts, and feeble at best at this point, to end the war in Ukraine? Any takers?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think that I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration does want this over, and I don't think that that's because Trump. That's for the sake of peace. I think it's because actually the US can't keep this running anymore. And there is in July 2024, there was a RAND report, RAND is this Pentagon Fund think tank, which stated that due to the extraordinary ammunition requirements of the war in Ukraine and Israel's assault on Gaza, the US cannot sustain its own munitions needs, let alone those of its allies. It doesn't have the defense industrial base to replenish at any pace or scale the enormous amount of shells and vehicles and ammunition that have been sent to Kiev to little avail. But I mean, I've written again and again that I do think that the British will attempt to scupper this one way or another. And recently, we just had a conference at which the British announced that our peacekeeping force in Ukraine won't be a peacekeeping force. It will be there to assist the Ukrainians. I mean, this is despite British generals currently serving and retired, both saying that this is a completely insane idea that Britain won't be able to sustain. But they seem absolutely determined. Now, is the purpose of that, or is there the thinking there, if you can even call it that, an attempt to draw the US back in by stoking some kind of direct confrontation between Western soldiers posted to Ukraine and Russia? It's not clear. And I think Alex has written recently about the potential of but a new front opening up in the Balkans. I mean, this is actually something that I wrote about back in January 2023, which is about excuse me. Yes, the British, who refer to the Balkans as their backyard, I might add, they have been involved in stirring up trouble in Bosnia. For instance, in October 2022, they helped overturn the results of the election, which was very, very unpopular locally, and led to calls for secession by Republika Srpska. And in response, they sent further peacekeeping forces into Bosnia in response to the tension that they created. And I think that that is a potentially key flashpoint, because similarly in Kosovo, you have a large number of British soldiers wandering around with their guns drawn. One stray trigger pull could cause a conflict.
Yeah. We've just got a couple of more minutes left. Alex, do you want to wind up with a last remark?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that the likelihood that the British will be able to scupper the peace deal between the United States and Russia and the peace in Ukraine, I think, is significantly reduced. And I think that the reason is because people in Trump administration have seen through the game. And I think that this vulgar three-card Monte over Ukraine's mineral deals, if somebody should see it coming from 10 light years away, it would be Donald Trump, because it really is a cheap hustle to get the United States to do all the dirty work, all the heavy lifting, in exchange for a cat in a bag, essentially. Whereas the alternative, if we just look at the logic of financial math, dealing with the Russians, who control a better part of the Ukraine's wealth, can guarantee security without war, without the risk of ending up in a nuclear confrontation, without having to provide the troops, the materiel, and shoulder the financial burden of that security guarantee, and then also get access to the remaining $75 to $90 trillion of Russian natural resource wealth. So the business, the economic math is clearly in favor of the United States dropping Western Europe and Britain in favor of dealing directly with Russia. The problem is that there's ideological headwinds, and they will have to overcome those. And I think that there's even internal opposition to this within the administration, but I think that the money matters will ultimately prevail.
Well, that's very interesting, Alex, because indeed Steve Witkoff said, as you, I'm sure, noticed when he came out of his 5-hour marathon with Putin, that there was an economic dimension to this, just as Marco Rubio had said that a couple of months ago. They both referred to these unnamed possibilities for economic cooperation. Let's hope you're right, Alex. Thank you very much indeed. Alex Kreiner from Croatia, Kit Klarenberg from Belgrade, and George Szamuely from Budapest. It's been fabulous talking to you all. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks to all our viewers for
Thank
watching.
you.
Hope to have you all on again soon. All the best. Bye.
Indeed. Take care, guys. Thank you.
Bye.